You use the word commonplace, and the decision to write an entire book about an event that is commonplace, bus accidents, road accidents happen all over the world, was a very deliberate one. And what my ambition with this book was to tell the story of an accident involving a group of Palestinian kindergartners, a number of whom died along with a teacher on a school bus in the greater Jerusalem area. And I had the ambition of telling the story of that accident, but also to tell the story of all of Israel-Palestine. And what I really wanted the book to do was to put you viscerally into the shoes of the characters. The people in this book live very segregated lives. There are residents of a town called Anata that is partially annexed by Israel in the greater Jerusalem area. And there are characters who live in the settlement of Anatot, built partly on Anata's lands, and these people have virtually no interaction with one another. And so I had the idea that in order to tell the greater story of Israel-Palestine in a place that is this segregated, I needed something like an accident that brought all of these lives together, and through their life stories and their family stories, I could tell the greater story of Israel-Palestine. I also had the ambition in telling of something commonplace to illuminate what it actually is to live under a system of domination, a system of Israeli control over Palestinian lives. And the way to understand that system is to actually navigate through it in the shoes of a particular man on the worst day of his life, when his son has been in an accident and he cannot even find where his son is located, what hospital he's been taken to. Because of the color of his ID, he can only access some of the hospitals that he's been told that the children have been taken to. And really, I've been involved in writing about Israel-Palestine for a long time, and part of that work that I did was working for an NGO called the International Crisis Group, and I greatly value the work of international organizations that are collecting data and presenting information about Israel-Palestine. But what I really think is much more valuable is the visceral sense that you get from just seeing it with your own eyes. I've seen how delegations of parliamentarians who come to visit Israel-Palestine, they always are given this week-long trip, and they're given 6 days in Israel and a half a day in the West Bank, maybe a full day in the West Bank. But the day in the West Bank is the most important because it is a gut punch. And it is so obvious to them that they are looking at a system of ethnic domination that is deeply, deeply unjust. And for me, the choice of choosing something commonplace like a bus accident was also the choice to take an event that couldn't be exceptionalized, that couldn't be written off as the decision of one bad commander, the decision of a prime minister under some very specific circumstances. I wanted a critique that was systemic.
Before we go deeper into the subject, there was another mystery when I read the book, is how did you get the trust of Abed Salama, the main character, the father, to tell you everything about his life, including very intimate stories about his past and failed love affairs or his missed marriage and things like that, which are very personal, and therefore to have that exposed in a book, you need an amount of trust in you, which I found amazing. How did you get to that level of intimacy with him?
So when we started, first of all, I should just say that all of the credit for that goes to Abid for bestowing that trust in me. We were planning to be on a book tour in the U.S. and the U.K. for 6 weeks. When the book came out, it was published on October 3rd in the U.S. and the U.K. And our tour was cut short after October 7th, but we did manage to do a number of events, and this was something that he was constantly asked. Abid was asked in these events is, why did you trust this guy?
Yes.
And so his answer was, the moment I told him the story, he had tears in his eyes. But I think the truth is that many of the parents, not just Abid, who were involved in this accident, lived under a kind of cloud of silence. People were very afraid to bring up the accident in front of them. They didn't want to upset them. And Abid was somebody who was hungry to remember his son and to talk about his son. And often when I did speak to him, he would cry. And he used to introduce me to people in Anata, to his relatives and neighbors, and say, this is the man who makes me cry. And so I would apologize to him when I would make him cry, and I'd say, I'm sorry that I'm putting you through this, and he would say, don't apologize. I feel closer to my son by talking to you, and I feel that he's here with us, and I relish the opportunity to talk about him. So I think that has more to do with it than anything.
The book makes us touch in a very precise way the geography, the physical, the transformation of the land through the years of occupation, through the roads, through the roadblocks, through the settlements, the schools, the hospitals, and that's a very incredible way of understanding the context. I mean, it's more precise than I've ever seen on that situation, and I've probably read everything that's been published. And was that your intention, to make us understand what you experience when you are a Palestinian in that part of the complex land?
Absolutely. That was the whole idea of the book, was really to let us understand this very complex and bureaucratic system of control through ordinary people who are having to navigate it, in this case, navigate it on the worst day of their lives, but the way that the system works is the way that it works for them every day. And I feel that it's often, intimidating to read all of the reports about the various layers of the system. There are so many different layers to it. There are entire reports you can write just about different forms of land acquisition by Israel in the West Bank, just about the road infrastructure. And rather than to describe that system in a kind of cold, analytic way, I felt that you could understand it much better by just being with a given parent, having to go through this system, and it actually becomes much more clear, much less complicated when you describe it in that way.
Especially, I think many people will be very surprised to discover the color of your ID that allows you to go to certain places and not to others, depending on whether you've been in prison, whether you which part of that small region, very small, because we're talking of a few kilometers, you live in. This color bar for your documents is a key element also of the whole day in the life of Abed Salama.
Absolutely. So Abed and the other parents who had children on the school bus live in an enclave that is surrounded on four sides by walls. It's about 130,000 people who live in this enclave. On three sides is what's called the separation barrier, sometimes called the apartheid wall, a 26-foot tall gray concrete wall. On the fourth side is a different colored wall that runs through a segregated road, Route 4370, with Israeli traffic on one side, Palestinian traffic on the other. And these walls entirely enclose these people within Anatta and the Shuafat camp. And about half of this community is formally annexed by Israel, and half of it is not annexed by Israel. But when you go into this area, you cannot tell what is officially Israeli territory and what is officially unannexed. It's all one undifferentiated zone of utter neglect. And this is an area that sits just beneath the Hebrew University at Mount Scopus, the most prestigious university in Israel. And from the manicured grounds of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, you can look down and you can see the checkpoint. You can see the single narrow road for these 130,000 people to move from one end of the enclave to the other. You can see that it has no sidewalks. You can see that it has no playgrounds. You can see an entirely different universe that these people live in on the other side of the wall. And half of the people in this community have a blue ID, which allows them to go through one of the two exits toward the rest of Jerusalem, where they have schools and workplaces and hospitals. And the other half have a green West Bank ID. They cannot go through that checkpoint to get to Jerusalem. And because there is a total shortage of classrooms for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and in particular in the areas on the other side of the wall, but it applies everywhere in East Jerusalem, we're talking about a shortage of some 2,000 classrooms. The parents really had very few options to send their kids to school within the enclave. So the choice that the parents with blue IDs faced was either to have their kids go through a checkpoint every morning and afternoon confronting Israeli soldiers, or to go to the single municipal school inside the enclave that's in a former goat pen, or if they could afford it, to send their kids to one of the private schools in the enclave. And this accident happened at one of these private schools. But the private school has kids who have both come from families with both blue and green IDs, and so they couldn't go through the checkpoint and go to the play areas just on the other side of the wall. They had to follow a long and circuitous path through a checkpoint and to the outskirts of Ramallah to go to a play area on the morning of the accident. And after passing through the checkpoint, they were struck by a giant semi-trailer. The bus flipped over, it caught fire. It was more than 30 minutes before the first Israeli fire truck arrived on the scene. And so who was left to try and help rescue these children from the burning bus were just ordinary people who happened to be traveling on the road that morning. This is a road that is used almost entirely by Palestinians, and they themselves have either green or blue IDs. So when a child was pulled off of the bus, covered in soot, and thrown in the back seat of a private car, the driver of that car, if he had a blue Jerusalem ID, would go through the checkpoint to the nearby and superior Jerusalem hospital, and if the driver had a green ID, he would go off in the opposite direction, most of them to the Ramallah hospital, some it went even further. And so this is how, when Abed arrived at the scene of the crash, he sees a crowd and all of the children are gone, and he asks, where are the children? And he's told they're at this Jerusalem hospital, they're at that Jerusalem hospital, they're at the military base a minute up the road, they're at the Ramallah hospital. And Abed himself has a green ID. He cannot access most of those places. So he winds up going to the place that he can go, the Ramallah hospital, and calls on relatives who have blue IDs to go search for his son at hospitals in Jerusalem. And it's through that search that we learn really about the intricacies of the permit system.
It's a nightmare, what you just described and what you describe in the book. But to add to the nightmare is the road system. Because this particular place where the accident took place is a road that has a history and a background. So tell us a little bit about that, because that helps understand the context of the story.
Yeah. So the accident took place in what is known as Area C of the West Bank. The West Bank is the part that has not been annexed, is divided into 3 zones: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area C is about 62% of the West Bank. And Area A and B, and this is the area that's under full Israeli control and administration. Any Palestinian needs to apply for a permit from Israel to build any extension on their home, to build an outhouse. Any building in Area C requires Israeli permission, which is almost never granted. And then when you do go ahead and build because your family's expanding, Israel will come and destroy the structure. So Area A and B are 165 little islands of limited Palestinian autonomy, surrounded by a sea of Area C control by Israel. And the accident took place in Area C, a road that's under full Israeli control. Israeli national police go on this road. They give traffic tickets on this road. And the road was initially built as a bypass road for settlers. So the basic ambition of the settler project is to grow. Now 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live in the occupied territories. The ambition is to, double the number that exist there now, and the main way to do it is by building road infrastructure that will create what I would call the suburbanization of the settlements. Make it so that these settlements feel no different than any suburb in Israel proper. And this is indeed what many of the settlements do feel like. You travel on a highway that goes straight to a settlement. You enter the settlement. You feel that you're in Israel. You see Israeli fire stations, Israeli police stations, health clinics, schools, shopping malls. You feel that you're in Israel, and a key part of that is the commute time, reducing the commute time. And so the bypass roads, the roads that were built for settlers to bypass Palestinian cities, because the old West Bank infrastructure, of course, goes through the main cities in the West Bank. The way to go around the West Bank would be to travel through Ramallah, not to go around it. But this road infrastructure is built for settlers, and what they would like to feel is a feeling of continuous Jewish presence from their workplaces in Israel to their homes, and not to see or think about all of the Palestinians whose lands they're cutting through on these highways. So this road that the accident took place on was originally a bypass road for settlers, and later a better bypass road for settlers was built. And so this road then became a road that was used mainly by Palestinians. And the way that the bypass roads work is that they're major highways, and they're cutting through a Palestinian village that often doesn't even have an entrance onto the highway that's cutting through their land, or they have an entrance that's very distant and circuitous to get onto the highway.
I'm going to use a dirty word, but it's apartheid. I lived in South Africa. I was a correspondent in South Africa during the time of apartheid in the 70s. And what you describe is even worse, to be honest, than what I experienced in South Africa. There were no roads that were banned for blacks. There were no infrastructure, so the infrastructure was common. What is surprising in your book is you feel very little anger about that from the Palestinian population. They seem to accept it as a fait accompli, as a that's life. Yeah, there is a kind of resilience to survive in the process, but not being angry at it.
Yeah. So I would say just about the first part about apartheid. The word apartheid appears once in the book, and it's to describe the road system as apartheid roads, and it's a quote from an Israeli official, an Israeli deputy defense minister who himself calls them apartheid roads. So you're not alone in using that description, of course.
Well, it was a taboo a few years ago
Yes.
to use it. When Jimmy Carter used it, it was a scandal and so on. Today, I think we've gone far beyond the words.
Yes. So the leading human rights organizations in the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN's Human Rights Council, all have made determinations that Israel is practicing apartheid. Former Israeli ministers, the former highest legal authority in Israel, the former Israeli Attorney General, has described it as apartheid.
In the occupied territories, because there's sometimes confusion between the pre-67 borders and the occupied territories. Obviously, it's not the same legal or even cohabitation. The 48 Palestinians, those who live in the Haifa or in places like that, don't have that kind of discrimination.
Right. So what you have, first of all, it depends on which report you're talking about. So, Human Rights Watch, their report on Israeli apartheid has maybe one of the largest sections is about Israeli practices toward the Bedouin in the Negev. Many people would find that those practices, which are very similar toward the Palestinian population in Area C, where you have the destruction of Palestinian communities in order to build Jewish communities or to expand Jewish communities adjacent to them. Of course, the situation for Bedouin in the Negev inside Israel proper is different than the situation for a Palestinian living in Haifa. And within the West Bank, it's different too. To live in Area C is a very different existence than to live in the center of a Palestinian city like Ramallah or Jenin. But it really, you can't use one characterization for all of the reports, because Human Rights Watch, for example, does an analysis of this Israeli intent to dominate, they say, applies across the entire territory. So under Israel's control. From the river to the sea, there's an intent to dominate. Human Rights Watch does say that the severity of the abuses rises to the level of apartheid in the West Bank. Amnesty International does not. They have an analysis that's simply Israel's practicing apartheid and Israel's an apartheid state, and they're not saying it's only in the West Bank. The UN Human Rights Council, their mandate is only to focus on the West Bank, so whatever they may think about practices inside Israel, they can't write about it anyway. But the point is that there is very little dispute in the international legal and human rights community today that Israel is practicing apartheid. The feeling that you had that it's in many ways worse than in South Africa is something that many South Africans, veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, have themselves said when they've visited. I've forgotten what the second
part was about the anger that is not obvious in your book.
So there. I think obviously Palestinians feel tremendous anger at the fact that their lives are under total Israeli control, that you cannot plan your day. You don't know if today there's going to be a soldier at the checkpoint who's going to make the journey of 20 minutes 2.5 hours instead. And to sit in that and to live in that every day and not to be able to plan anything, a meeting in your life, is enraging. It's infuriating. But with respect to the actual accident, I often found in my conversations with Palestinians is that I was often bringing up these kinds of structural reasons that day unfolded in the way that it did. That there was an Israeli policy of deliberate neglect of these hundreds of thousands of people on the other side of the wall. That there was a system of segregated roads, etc. And that they all took for granted. And they said, oh, of course. But they weren't even thinking about it. And it reminded me of, there's a famous speech that David Foster Wallace gave at a college graduation, where he tells a joke that I'll probably bungle, but the essence of it was that one fish is passing another fish, and the fish says, how's the water today? And the other fish replies, what's water? And in a way, this was kind of what some of my conversations with the Palestinians who were affected by the accident were like. I would bring up these structural reasons, which they said, yes, of course, but they were focusing their own energies, their own anger on things that were conceivable that they could have some control over, like, the behavior of the Palestinian insurance company, or something very micro, because it was obvious to them that there was no hope of actually changing these big structural things that I was raising.
One aspect of the life that you describe is also the small compromise that people make with the occupation, like having good relation with the officer who will allow a car to go to that or that place, even good relations with some of the settlers who might offer some assistance for construction material or something like that. How can you describe that kind of daily accommodation with the realities of the occupation?
I'm glad that you raised that, because that is very much a theme of the book, and that's part of this system of control being so pervasive and affecting every aspect of your life. You have relatives who are working in the Palestinian Authority, and you yourself, someone like Abed, objects to what the Palestinian Authority is doing. In his view, it's clearly a key pillar of maintaining the system of control indefinitely. And yet it's somebody that he loves, that he's connected to. This person has his own rationalizations, and you have a suspicion that hangs over an entire society, because Israel is abusing the permit system, and it is interrogating people and asking for them to give information in order to get your mother to get a visit at the hospital inside Israel for her medical treatment that she needs. And this is happening everywhere, and so you see that somebody next to you, suddenly they have access to Jerusalem. How did you get a blue ID? This was true of the family of the truck driver who ran into the bus. Many people in the town were very suspicious of them because they came from an area where you never get a blue ID, and somehow Israel bestowed it on them. These kinds of calculations of how far you can go or not go affect your everyday existence. You apply for a permit, you're called in for questioning. They ask you general questions in the beginning. How is the situation generally? What's the economic situation? How do people feel in your town? And then they get more and more detailed. And you don't know when you've crossed the line. And there's no way to exit that room not feeling dirty. And I know people friends who've gone through this process and come to visit me immediately after going through it. And that's your whole life.
I'm going to come to the more general situation, because what you just described is the pattern of what it's been for decades in the occupied territories. But since October 7, something has changed in the sense that there was this famous sentence by Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the UN, saying this didn't happen in a void. And suddenly this background comes back to haunt Israel and the situation. Nothing justifies what happened on October 7. Obviously, it was a barbarian method used by Hamas in the south of Israel. But what you've described in the book and just now is a kind of a pattern on which Israel was thinking that it could last forever, that it would continue to take a few hectares, take down a few olive trees, and build another settlement and so on, forever without anyone complaining. Do you think this has died on October 7th, that this cannot go on forever, or nothing has changed?
Immediately after October 7th, I thought this is evidence that maintaining the status quo, maintaining the occupation, managing the conflict, as Israelis describe it, clearly has shown that it's not. It's clearly been shown that it's not working. But I no longer have that hope. I actually I have long said that I don't believe that the occupation is unsustainable. It's the most cliche phrase you hear from diplomats for decades. It's unsustainable. Israel, cannot continue. It must eventually choose. It has to either give the Palestinians citizenship and equal rights or sovereignty on 22% of the land, as the PLO is demanding. But the fact is, Israel doesn't have to choose. It has never had to choose until this point, and I don't see any evidence that it will have to choose in the foreseeable future. There is a third option, which is to maintain this system. You can make adjustments to it. You can alter it. There's a first intifada, and out of it came, the establishment of the Palestinian Authority with limited autonomy and indirect Israeli control. The system changes, but the overall practice of depriving Palestinians of basic civil rights indefinitely, I think has a long life ahead of it.
So between the three options, one state, two states, or status quo, you think the third one is the most likely?
Absolutely. It would take a revolution. It would take a revolution inside Israel, it would take a revolution among Palestinians, and it would take a revolution from the international community and how they're treating the situation to make it so that something other than perpetuating the system of domination becomes a possibility.
And you don't think that out of the current tragedy on both sides, because the Palestinians in Gaza are suffering immense tragedy, but the Israelis, in a way, have had their share of trauma, have still hostages, have soldiers who die and who fight in an economy that is being hit, an unpopularity in the world which is unprecedented. You don't think that will lead to something?
There is this line of thinking that, after the 1973 war,
Sadat came to Jerusalem.
And also even the process before that of Israel starting to realize that it couldn't continue to control the Sinai forever, and it started to move toward these limited withdrawal agreements, these iterative withdrawals that preceded the peace treaty. That out of some kind of major disaster that shows that there is this great cost to be paid, that you can have a real substantial change. So I don't want to write it off entirely. I think there is some slim chance that could happen, but I think it would require a real change in incentives for Israel. The difference with 73 is that Egypt could launch another attack, like it did in 73. I think Israel understands that the power differential is so great that they could easily control Gaza or stay in Gaza in a way that would prevent something like October 7th from happening. And even October 7th, even without occupying Gaza, if Israel just had 3 times as many troops on the border, that day would have looked entirely different.
But in the book, you talk about the Oslo agreements a little bit. There's a couple of references in which you say that in a way, it was rationalization of the occupation, that it was cost-cutting, a cost-cutting agreement in the sense that the Israeli authorities delegated to the Palestinian Authority the control and management of certain areas. I was a correspondent in Jerusalem at that time, and I have a different feeling. I have a feeling that those who negotiated the agreement, I'm talking of the Shimon Peres, the political side, not the military side which then took over, but had some kind of idea that cohabitation could come out of it and some peace. Peace is a complicated word, but could come out of this. That it was not just a cynical ploy to occupy better the territories.
Yeah. So I think it very much depends on which particular Israelis you're talking about. But if we look at Rabin, who is the prime minister, he himself said, this is on record, that he changed his view about the sustainability of Israel's occupation as a result of the First Intifada. And that First Intifada convinced him that this territory was ungovernable in the present circumstances, and he needed to change those. And he has this famous quote of now putting the PA in place without the High Court of Justice and without the leading human rights organization, B'Tselem, watching us. Rabin was very clear that this was going to be, the PA was going to be there occupying by proxy. In terms of the long-term vision for what he wanted to come out of Oslo, he gave a famous speech in the Knesset a month before he was killed, where he described what it was he intended with Oslo. And in that speech, he famously described his end state. Of course, the Oslo agreements do not just say the word state. They don't include the word state. There was no promise of a Palestinian state within Oslo. And Rabin said that what he intended was for Oslo to lead eventually to a Palestinian state minus. So with fully unified Israeli control over Jerusalem, with settlements staying in place, and with Israel controlling the eastern border of a Palestinian state minus. So that's what Rabin's vision was. And actually, if you look at the speech by Netanyahu in 2009, the famous Bar Ilan speech, when he was very frightened by the incoming president, Barack Obama, and that Obama would apply all kinds of pressure to him, Netanyahu also, he was described in the Israeli press as having crossed the Rubicon. He finally talked about Palestinian statehood. He also said Palestinian state minus. I think Rabin's quote was less than a state. Netanyahu said state minus. They meant the same thing. And if you look actually at the principles that Netanyahu lays out, unified Jerusalem, controlling the Jordan Valley, most of the settlements stay in place, it's the same vision. And so, I think a lot of the time when we talk about two states, it's in a very general way that makes us think that there's more agreement than there actually is. Many people who use the phrase two states are really talking about a kind of autonomy.
So you don't think that a Palestinian state, with all the meaning of the word state, is possible?
I think it's possible, but again, with a revolution, with a total change in incentives. Yeah.
And what do you make of these huge demonstrations in Israel, which don't call for a Palestinian state, but call for Netanyahu to leave, for elections to come, for Israel to sign a ceasefire agreement as proposed recently by Joe Biden? Is there in these huge demonstrations the potential for the peace movement that existed 20 or 30 years ago?
No, because the actual prioritization of the freedom of Palestinians is not there in these protests. In the protests that occurred against the so-called judicial reform, there were huge protests in Israel for the year prior to October 7th. Enormous numbers came out. The headline of these protests was preserving Israeli democracy. And this was, essentially the group of secular, centrist, center-left Israelis coming out in large numbers because they felt that their interests as Israeli Jews were threatened, that Israel was sliding into a theocracy. People were going at night and doing Zoom classes about the principles of democracy and the importance of a judicial system and judicial independence and so forth. So everybody's focused on democracy, and there was almost no talk of the millions of Palestinians living under Israeli control without basic civil rights in those protests. There was a very, very small group within them that was quite marginal. So that is the presence of the call, the real demand for Palestinians to have freedom in those protests. And similarly today, again, when you see people coming out and demanding that a deal be accepted, it's very vague about what they're actually willing to accept with a deal. It's, again, the same, basically, sociologically, the same group of people who want Netanyahu to be gone. But, again, it's not about, we're killing too many Palestinians in Gaza. It's about, let's get the hostages home. That's the message.
And were you surprised by the reactions internationally on U.S. campuses, on French campuses, that kind of very heated reaction that we heard and we saw in many countries in the world, because that's unprecedented on the Palestinian question?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, we've seen this. We've seen activism surge in previous Gaza wars. This is on a much greater scale, both the war and the activism. And I think my real concern is about the future. That this mobilization will, of course, dissipate as soon as the war finally ends. And, it will once again, Israel-Palestine will not be on the top of the international agenda. And I fear that we will return to a situation not unlike the one before October 7th, where it was very hard to get anybody to care about Israel-Palestine. And the whole world was actually quite indifferent.
Yeah, but that's changed. It's true that for 20 years it was no longer on the front page of any newspaper in the world. But do you think we're going to go back to a situation where we're going to close our eyes to the situation there? Can Israel live as a semi-pariah state as it is nowadays? Because in public opinions, at least, in many parts of the world, do you think they care about that, or that has a cost for Israel?
Right now, there's no cost. Let's look at what's the lowest hanging fruit in European policy toward Israel. It would be banning settlement products. You would think most mainstream people could support this. They don't want to actually be financially supporting the violation of international law, giving aid to the settlement project, and that is nowhere on the agenda. It's not on the table. It's not within reach. So that's where we are with respect to actual consequences for Israel right now. And it's sadly very easy for me to imagine that we will return to a situation where the whole world will continue to basically accept the indefinite control of Palestinians without basic civil rights, and in some cases, to overtly support it.
And the Palestinians will accept it?
The Palestinians don't accept it, they won't accept it.
No, but
they have very little means to change it. And we saw it also with previous Gaza wars. We saw previous Gaza wars where, again, Gaza is in the front pages. There is mobilization in capitals around the world. And there is a call from a strongly worded call from leading diplomats, heads of state, that are saying this war must end, and we have to return to a situation of calm. And then as soon as the war's over, they're okay with that calm. And in a way, that was the whole desire of this book, was to describe the so-called calm that isn't calm at all, and to bring our attention to that rather than to only be focused on Israel-Palestine when there's huge levels of bloodshed, because we're continuing to ignore this system of domination that will continue to result in more and more bloodshed.
The time you describe in the book is more than 10 years ago. It's 2012, I think,
Yes.
for the accident. What do the Abed Salamas of today think of the situation? How do they feel about Hamas? How do they feel about continuing to live in with those constraints and discriminations? What's their vision, and who do they trust?
So, Abed and many Palestinians I know actually are quite hopeful that this moment can lead to a real fundamental change. I've heard this from many, many friends and associates and people I've interviewed, and they think that this level of destruction, this level of suffering and killing is invariably going to lead to some fundamental change in the architecture of the occupation.
So they are more optimistic than you.
Much more. Much more. Yeah.
But who do they trust? Is there?
Oh,
I mean,
there's
there's a lot of talk about Barghouti, who is in jail, has been in jail for 20 years, as the savior of the Palestinian, the Mandela of Palestine. Is that serious? What's their level of trust in the political groups and elites?
It's very, very low. In general, there's the PLO, the National Liberation Movement of the Palestinians, is a shell of its former self. It was destroyed by the Oslo process. The PLO is the one that negotiated Oslo. Today, the PLO is a line item in the budget of the PA Finance Ministry. And all of the power is with the PA. And the PLO is really a shriveled, shadow of its former self. And most Palestinians are very, very cynical about the political leadership. And out of that, you do see, public opinion polls show for sure that Hamas, which is the one group that is fighting Israel now, and their levels of support in the West Bank are higher than they've ever been.
Which leads to a strange optimism, because where will that change come from? If you are a Palestinian like Abed Salama, where if you're hopeful that something will come out of it, who is going to help it come out?
I mean, one person who could help it come out is Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who's imposing sanctions on the PA, threatening it with collapse. I know Palestinians who are rooting for him to succeed in collapsing the PA, because they understand that this PA is ultimately a pillar of support for their indefinite occupation.
So general chaos, an apocalyptic vision is shared by the Jewish extremist groups and some Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think both sides imagine it to be less apocalyptic than it might actually turn out to be. I think, Smotrich imagines that he can collapse the PA without there being major consequences for Israeli security. And I think that the Palestinians I know who hope the PA collapses imagine that it could lead to some kind of unification of Palestinians and in something like the first Intifada, when in fact it could result in internal strife and bloodshed.
Mm-hmm. We're going to take a couple of questions, and then there will be a signing, and you can continue to discuss with Nathan. But if we have time for maybe a couple of questions, I see a hand right in the back.